My religious daughter demanded I attend church and get over my trauma, so I gave her an ultimatum. 6 months ago, my 15-year-old daughter Grace converted to extremist Christianity and became unrecognizable. She went from outgoing teenager to Bible-obsessed recluse who judges everyone. She cut off her gay brother Daniel, leaving whenever he visits. She nags me constantly about church, fundraisers, Bible study, wanting me involved in everything. 2 months ago, after she nagged me all day about joining her church, I exploded and told her why I'll never step foot in a church. When I was 13, I was raped by my pastor. She went quiet. I thought she understood. A week later, she started again. Just become Christian. You don't have to attend church. I shut her down. We've been going back and forth since. Tonight, she crossed every line. After my 10-hour shift, she started nagging at dinner. I told her to stop. She said, "I get what happened is bad, but it happened over 20 years ago. Get over it. Open your heart to Christ." My stare made her excuse herself upstairs. I stormed up to her room. This ends one of 2 ways. Stop nagging about your Christian nonsense or pack your Bible and get out. You can live with your father. Her father, my ex-husband Chris, is a practicing Satanist, something Grace doesn't know. 24 hours to decide. This morning, Grace's room was empty. She'd left a note. "I choose God over you." I called Chris. Did Grace show up? No, why would she? I explained everything. Chris went silent. "Claire, I haven't been a Satanist for years. I converted to Christianity. I attend New Life Ministry." My blood went cold. That was Grace's church. You converted her? No, I had no idea she attended. But if she's not with either of us... I called her best friend Caroline. Have you seen Grace? She's at Pastor Julius's house. She's been staying there since last night. Pastor Julius? From New Life. He's been mentoring her. He said she could stay whenever things got tough at home. Every alarm screamed in my head. A 15-year-old staying with an adult man. How long has this been going on? Few months. He picks her up for youth group, drives her home. They have one-on-one Bible study. He says she's special, that God has plans for her. I hung up, called police, then drove to New Life Ministry. I'd sworn never to enter a church again, but my daughter was in danger. I pushed past the secretary to Pastor Julius's office. He was there with Grace, sitting too close on a couch, his hand on her shoulder. "Mom? What are you doing here?" "We're leaving, now." Pastor Julius stood, mid-30s, artificial charm perfected. Grace came for spiritual guidance. She's safe here. "Get your hand off my daughter." "Mom, you're embarrassing me. Pastor Julius says I'm special." God's plan. I looked at this man, saw my pastor from 27 years ago. "Grace, we're leaving." "No. Pastor Julius says God brought us together for a reason." I noticed her necklace, an expensive gold cross I'd never seen. "Where did you get that?" "Pastor Julius gave it to me, for my dedication." I looked around his office. Photos covered one wall. All girls, all Grace's age, all wearing identical gold crosses. "How many girls are you mentoring?" His smile faltered. "I guide many young people." "Just the special ones with old souls?" Those exact words my pastor had used. "I'm staying with Pastor Julius," Grace said. "He has a room prepared just for me at the ministry house." "A room prepared for my underage daughter?" "It's for troubled youth." "She's not troubled. She's being groomed." The door burst open. Chris stood there with 2 police officers. "That's him," Chris said. "Julius Richardson. He's violating his sex offender registration." Pastor Julius's face drained. The officer stepped forward. "Julius Richardson, you're under arrest. You're prohibited from working with children." "Sex offender?" Grace whispered. "That's impossible. He's a man of God." Mr. Richardson was convicted of inappropriate conduct with minors at his previous church in Ohio. Grace collapsed. But he said God forgave him. He said his past was washed clean. Chris knelt beside her. Predators don't change. They just find new hunting grounds. As they led Pastor Julius out, he called, "Grace, remember what we discussed about your mother's trauma, how some people use victimhood to control others." Grace looked at me with tears. "He said you were lying about being raped. He said victims always lie. That's what predators say to protect themselves." But he showed me articles, studies. "Did he show you his conviction records?" She broke down sobbing. Chris said quietly, "All those one-on-one Bible studies." I looked at Grace. "Honey, did anything happen during your sessions?" She was silent too long. "He said it was holy. He said Mary was young too when God chose her. He said I was chosen." I felt sick. Chris was already calling the detective. Grace's next words stopped me cold. "Mom, I think I'm pregnant." My world tilted. "What?" He said if it happened, it would be God's will, like Mary. Chris grabbed his phone. "We need a hospital. Now." "There's more," Grace whispered. "The ministry house. There are other girls there. Caroline, Sarah, Rebecca. We all have the same necklace. We all have special rooms." "How many?" I asked. 7, all between 14 and 16. The detective on Chris's phone was already dispatching units to the ministry house. Grace grabbed my hand. "Mom, he has videos. Of all of us. He said they were for documenting our spiritual journey." "But..." She didn't need to finish. "Where?" the detective asked through the phone. "His office computer. Password is Matthew 19:14, the verse about letting children come to him." Detective Dickerson pulled his phone from his pocket and punched in a number with quick, hard jabs. Grace sat on the church office couch where Pastor Julius had been sitting with her just minutes before, her whole body shaking like she was freezing even though the room was warm. I kept my hand on her shoulder, trying to ground her, trying to tell her without words that I was here and I wasn't leaving. Chris stood by the door talking fast into his own phone, giving the address of the ministry house to someone named Joan Hanks. I caught pieces of what he was saying about locked rooms and cameras and other girls, and my stomach twisted tighter with every word. Grace had gone pale, staring at her hands like she'd never seen them before. The gold cross necklace hung against her shirt and I wanted to rip it off her neck and throw it across the room. Dickerson finished his call and crouched down in front of Grace, his voice gentle but urgent. He needed to know exactly where Pastor Julius kept his computer, what kind of security he had, whether anyone else had access to the files. Grace answered in a whisper, explaining that Pastor Julius kept the laptop in his desk drawer at the ministry house, that he always locked it when he wasn't using it, that he made each of them watch him upload the videos after their sessions. My hands clenched into fists hearing her describe it so matter-of-factly, like she didn't understand what those videos really were. Dickerson asked if Pastor Julius had talked about sharing the files with anyone, and Grace shook her head, but then she paused. He'd mentioned something about a private server for backup, about keeping everything safe in case something happened to his computer. Dickerson swore under his breath and made another call, this time to someone he called the forensic tech, explaining they needed to move fast before anyone could access the system remotely. Chris finished his call and came over to us, his face gray. Joan Hanks was mobilizing a team to hit the ministry house in 20 minutes, and they needed us to stay here at the church until they secured the location. Grace started crying again, quiet tears running down her face. She kept saying the other girls' names over and over like a prayer or a confession. Caroline, Sarah, Rebecca, and 4 others I didn't know. 7 girls total, all of them believing Pastor Julius when he said God chose them special. I thought about those girls right now in their locked rooms at the ministry house, not knowing police were coming, maybe thinking they were safe and blessed and loved. My chest felt so tight I could barely breathe. The ministry house sat 3 blocks from the church, a plain 2-story building that looked like any other rental in the neighborhood. Joan Hanks arrived with 6 other officers, all of them wearing regular clothes instead of uniforms, so they wouldn't spook anyone inside. Dickerson had driven us over to wait in his car half a block away where we could see but not interfere. Grace pressed her face against the window, watching the officers approach the front door. Chris sat in the back seat with his hand on Grace's shoulder, and I could hear him breathing hard like he'd been running. The officers knocked first, then used a key they'd gotten from the church office to unlock the door. They went in fast, spreading through the house in pairs. We couldn't hear what was happening, but we could see lights coming on in different windows, could see shadows moving behind curtains. Grace squeezed my hand so hard my fingers went numb. After what felt like forever but was probably only 5 minutes, Joan Hanks came out the front door and waved for Dickerson to bring us over. We got out of the car and walked toward the house, and I could see Grace's legs shaking with every step. Inside, the house looked normal at first, just a regular living room with a couch and TV and some religious pictures on the walls. But then Joan led us down a hallway and I saw the doors. 6 of them, all with deadbolts on the outside, all locked from the hall. Joan had already opened them, and through each doorway I could see a small bedroom decorated with crosses and Bible verses painted on the walls. Each room had a twin bed with a pink bedspread, a small desk, and a camera mounted in the ceiling vent that you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. In the first room, a girl who looked about 14 sat on the bed hugging her knees, staring at the officers like she didn't understand what was happening. The second room held a girl maybe 15, already crying, asking if she was in trouble. The third room was Sarah, the oldest at 16, who Joan said had been living here the longest. Sarah stood by her desk with her arms crossed, her face blank like she'd shut down completely. The other 3 girls were in various states of confusion and fear, and all of them wore the same gold cross necklace Grace had. Joan explained to each girl that they weren't in trouble, that Pastor Julius had been arrested, that their parents were being contacted. Most of the girls just stared. One started screaming that this was a mistake, that Pastor Julius would never hurt them, that God would punish everyone for interfering with his ministry. Sarah was the only one who seemed to understand. She looked at Joan and asked in a flat voice if the cameras in the bathrooms were real or if she'd imagined them. Joan confirmed they were real, hidden in the exhaust fans, and Sarah nodded like she'd expected that answer. Grace made a choking sound beside me and I pulled her close, but she pushed away and ran to the bathroom down the hall. I heard her getting sick, and Chris went after her while I stayed frozen in the hallway, looking at these 6 rooms that were supposed to be safe spaces for spiritual growth, but were actually cells for keeping victims controlled and documented. The ambulances showed up 10 minutes later, 3 of them lined up outside the ministry house. The paramedics were gentle with the girls, explaining they were going to the hospital for medical checks, that their parents would meet them there. Most of the girls went quietly, too shocked or confused to protest. The one who'd been screaming about God's punishment fought the paramedics until Joan finally convinced her that going to the hospital didn't mean she'd done anything wrong. Grace and I rode in the first ambulance, and Grace gripped my hand so hard I thought she might break bones. She kept whispering the same thing over and over, that she was so stupid. How could she be so stupid? Why didn't she see what was happening? I tried to tell her she wasn't stupid, that Pastor Julius was a professional predator who'd done this before, that he'd targeted her specifically because she was smart and searching for meaning. But Grace just shook her head and cried harder, saying she should have known. Everyone always says to watch out for men like that. Why didn't she watch out? The paramedic in the back with us tried to help, explaining that predators are experts at manipulation, that they spend months or years building trust before they start the abuse. Grace wouldn't listen. She'd pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, making herself as small as possible. I wanted to hold her, but she kept pulling away every time I tried, so I just sat there with my hand on her shoe, the only contact she'd allow. Through the ambulance window, I could see Chris's car following us with Caroline in the passenger seat. Caroline had her face in her hands, and I knew she was crying too, probably blaming herself for not telling someone sooner about Pastor Julius's behavior. The ambulance driver took us to County General, the biggest hospital in the area, and I could see news vans already pulling into the parking lot. Someone had tipped off the media, and now this nightmare was going to play out in public. Grace saw the cameras and made a sound like a wounded animal, and the paramedic radioed ahead to have security ready to keep the reporters away from the emergency entrance. The emergency department had cleared a private section for all 7 girls and their families. A woman in her 40s with kind eyes and an ID badge that said Virginia Silva met us at the intake desk. She introduced herself as a victim advocate and explained she'd be with us through the whole process, helping coordinate medical care and police interviews and whatever else we needed. Her voice was calm and professional, but also warm, like she genuinely cared about every word she was saying. She took Grace's hand and explained exactly what the medical examination would involve, step by step, no surprises. Grace finally stopped shaking as Virginia talked, and I realized this was the first adult besides me who'd spoken to her today without either judgment or pity. Virginia explained they'd do a physical exam to document any injuries, collect evidence for the criminal case, and run tests for pregnancy and infections. Grace would have a female doctor and nurse, and Virginia would be in the room the whole time if Grace wanted. Grace nodded and asked in a tiny voice if I could come too. Virginia said, of course, whatever made Grace feel safest. She led us to a private exam room and introduced us to Dr. Stowe, a woman in her 50s who specialized in assault cases. While we waited for the exam to start, Virginia told us her husband Archibald was a child psychologist who worked with trauma victims, and he was already at the hospital coordinating crisis counseling for all 7 girls. The hospital social worker Lawrence Riggs was setting up a private waiting area for all the families, and Virginia promised we'd have privacy and support through everything that came next. Grace asked how many other families were here, and Virginia said all 6, that we were about to meet 6 other parents going through the exact same nightmare. Grace started crying again, saying she'd brought this on all of them by telling Pastor Julius about her family problems, by making herself such an easy target. Virginia stopped her gently and explained that predators don't need victims to make themselves easy targets, because predators create the circumstances that make targeting possible. Grace looked at her like she didn't understand, and Virginia said they'd talk more about that later. But for now, Grace needed to focus on getting through the medical exam. The waiting room Lawrence had set up was down a side hallway away from the main emergency department. When we got there after Grace's exam started, I saw parents sitting in small groups, some crying, some just staring at nothing. A woman about my age sat in the corner with her face in her hands, her whole body shaking with sobs. A man in a police uniform sat with his head down, his hands clasped so tight his knuckles were white. He kept saying the same thing over and over, that he should have known, he should have seen it. How could he miss the signs when he's trained to spot predators? His wife sat next to him rubbing his back, but she looked just as destroyed. Another couple stood by the window holding each other, not saying anything, just holding on like they'd fall apart if they let go. Virginia moved between families with a box of tissues and a clipboard, checking in with everyone, making sure they had what they needed. She'd stop and listen when someone needed to talk, offer resources when someone asked about next steps, and somehow maintain this sense of calm authority that made me feel like maybe someone actually knew what they were doing here. I sat down in a chair by myself because Chris was still with Caroline, and I realized I was barely holding myself together. My hands were shaking and my chest felt tight, and I kept seeing those locked bedroom doors over and over in my head. A woman sat down next to me and introduced herself as Rebecca's mother. She asked if my daughter was one of the 7, and when I nodded, she started crying and apologizing. She said Rebecca had been missing school 3 days a week for 4 months for church activities, and she'd never questioned it because Pastor Julius had convinced her that Rebecca was mentored for youth leadership. She'd thought her daughter was safe, thought the church was providing guidance and community, and instead they'd handed her child to a predator with a criminal record. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just sat there while she cried, and Virginia brought her tissues and water she didn't drink. Grace's exam took 2 hours, and when she finally came out of the exam room, she wouldn't look at anyone. Her face was blank, her eyes unfocused, and she walked like she was moving through water. Dr. Stowe asked to speak with me and Chris privately, and Virginia took Grace to sit in a quiet corner while we followed the doctor to a small office. Dr. Stowe closed the door and explained in careful, clinical language that they'd found evidence consistent with sexual assault, both recent and older injuries that suggested multiple incidents over time. They'd collected everything needed for the criminal case, documented everything with photos and samples, and started Grace on emergency contraception and medications to prevent infections. The pregnancy test would take a few hours for results, but they'd already drawn blood and sent it to the lab. Dr. Stowe's voice stayed professional and detached while she described what they'd found, and I realized she had to stay detached, or she'd never be able to do this job. But hearing her describe my daughter's injuries in medical terms made everything feel surreal, like we were talking about someone else's child, someone else's nightmare. Chris asked if Grace would need surgery or ongoing medical treatment, and Dr. Stowe said no. The injuries would heal on their own, but Grace would need significant psychological support to process the trauma. She recommended a therapist who specialized in assault cases involving religious manipulation, and she gave us a referral card with a phone number. When we came back out to the waiting area, Grace was sitting with Virginia, not talking, just sitting. I sat down next to her and tried to take her hand, but she pulled away and wrapped her arms around herself. She wouldn't look at me, wouldn't look at Chris, just stared at the floor like she wished she could disappear into it. Detective Dickerson found us in the waiting room an hour later and asked if we could talk privately. He led me, Chris, and Virginia to a small conference room down the hall and closed the door. His face looked grim as he opened his laptop and turned it toward us. He explained they'd already accessed Pastor Julius's computer and found over 200 video files dating back 3 months. Each file was labeled with a girl's name and a date, and the content ranged from counseling sessions where Pastor Julius manipulated the girls psychologically to explicit documentation of sexual abuse. Dickerson's voice stayed flat and professional as he described what they'd found, but I could see the anger in his jaw, the way his hands clenched when he talked about the files. He said this level of documentation suggested Pastor Julius was either planning to sell the material or use it to control the girls long-term, probably both. The videos showed him gradually escalating physical contact during counseling sessions, testing boundaries, normalizing touch, and then moving to explicit abuse while using religious language to frame everything as holy and chosen by God. Dickerson said they'd also found journals where Pastor Julius described each girl's vulnerabilities, her family situation, what manipulation tactics worked best on her. Grace's journal entries talked about her conflict with me over religion, her desperate need for spiritual community, her guilt about rejecting her brother. Pastor Julius had identified every weak point and exploited it systematically. I felt sick reading the clinical way he'd analyzed my daughter's pain and turned it into an access point for abuse. Chris made a choking sound and pushed away from the table, and I realized he was about to throw up. Virginia got him a trash can just in time, and he heaved into it while Dickerson and I sat there not knowing what to do. When Chris finally stopped, he looked at Dickerson with tears running down his face and asked how many other churches Pastor Julius had done this at before New Life. Dickerson said they were still investigating his history, but his conviction in Ohio involved similar patterns with teenage girls at his previous church. Chris broke down completely after we left the conference room, and I'd never seen him cry like that before. He kept apologizing over and over, saying this was his fault for bringing Grace to New Life Ministry, for not researching the church more carefully, for not noticing the signs that something was wrong. He said he should have asked more questions when Grace started spending so much time at church, should have met Pastor Julius sooner, should have checked his background. I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, that Pastor Julius was a professional predator who'd fooled an entire church congregation, but I was too angry at the universe to comfort anyone. So I just sat there in the waiting room feeling numb while Chris cried and Virginia brought us coffee we didn't drink. A man I didn't recognize came in about 20 minutes later and sat down next to Chris. He introduced himself as Raymond Buckner, Chris's sponsor from a different church, and he'd come as soon as Chris called. Raymond didn't try to make Chris feel better or tell him everything would be okay. He just sat there quietly while Chris processed his guilt, occasionally putting a hand on his shoulder but mostly just being present. I watched them and realized Chris had built a support system through his church that I hadn't known about, people who showed up when things got hard. It made me feel even more isolated because I had no one like that, no community to call when my world fell apart. Virginia came over and asked if I wanted her to contact anyone for me, family or friends who could be here, but I shook my head. My parents were dead, my siblings lived across the country, and I'd let most of my friendships fade over the years because I was too busy working and raising kids. The only person I had was Chris, and he was barely holding himself together. Dr. Stowe found us 2 hours later with Grace's pregnancy test results. She asked to speak with me and Chris privately again, and I knew from her face what she was going to say before she said it. The test came back positive, hormone levels consistent with about 6 weeks along. Dr. Stowe explained in that same careful, clinical voice that based on the timing, conception happened during one of Pastor Julius's private Bible study sessions at the ministry house. She'd already discussed options with Grace, and Grace wanted time to think about what she wanted to do. Dr. Stowe said that was completely normal and healthy, that Grace should take whatever time she needed to make the decision that felt right for her. But she also explained that Grace was showing signs of severe psychological trauma, and they were recommending a psychiatric evaluation before she went home. I asked what that meant, and Dr. Stowe said Grace's affect had gone completely flat during the exam. She wasn't responding to questions appropriately, and she seemed to be dissociating from reality. A child psychologist named Archibald Silva, Virginia's husband, had already evaluated Grace and was recommending admission to the pediatric psychiatric unit for observation and crisis stabilization. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. My daughter was pregnant from being raped by her pastor, and now she was so traumatized she needed psychiatric hospitalization. Dr. Stowe said she was sorry, she knew this was overwhelming, but Grace's safety had to come first. Within an hour, Grace was admitted to the pediatric psych unit on the 4th floor. They gave her a private room with a window that didn't open and a bathroom with no lock on the door. A nurse explained the unit rules when visiting hours were, what items Grace could and couldn't have. Grace didn't react to any of it, just lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling like she'd already left her body. I stayed with Grace in her hospital room while Chris went downstairs to handle the police paperwork and give his initial statement. Grace hadn't spoken in 3 hours, just lay in the bed staring at nothing. A nurse brought her dinner on a tray, chicken and mashed potatoes and green beans, but Grace didn't even look at it. I tried to hold her hand, but she pulled away, curling onto her side facing the wall. I sat in the chair by her bed and watched her breathe, watched the way her shoulders stayed rigid like she was holding herself together through sheer force. I recognized that posture because I'd lived in it for years after my own rape, that sense of being so ashamed you can't let anyone touch you, can't let anyone see how broken you feel inside. I started talking quietly about my own experience, about how long it took me to understand it wasn't my fault, about how shame is a weapon predators use to keep victims silent. I told her about the years I spent avoiding churches and distrusting religious people, about how I'd let my trauma control my life instead of dealing with it. I didn't know if Grace was listening, but I kept talking anyway because the silence felt more dangerous than saying the wrong thing. I told her I was sorry for giving her that ultimatum, for pushing her away when she needed me most, for letting my own trauma blind me to the grooming happening right in front of me. I told her I loved her and I believed her and nothing that happened was her fault. Grace didn't respond, didn't move, just kept staring at the wall while tears ran down her face onto the pillow. Around midnight, Grace turned her head slightly and spoke for the first time in hours. Her voice came out scratchy and small. She asked if I hated her for choosing Pastor Julius over me. The question hit me like a physical blow. Something cracked open in my chest and suddenly I was crying harder than I'd cried in years. I told her I could never hate her, that this wasn't her fault, that she was manipulated by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. I said I was sorry for giving her that ultimatum, for pushing her away when she needed me most. I admitted I was so scared of losing her to extremism that I drove her straight into a predator's hands. Grace started crying too, and we held each other across the hospital bed while we both sobbed. A night nurse opened the door to check on us, saw us clinging to each other, and quietly closed the door again to give us privacy. We cried until we were both exhausted, and Grace fell asleep with her hand still gripping mine. The next morning, a man in an expensive suit arrived and introduced himself as District Attorney Clarence Hull. He had silver hair and the kind of confident presence that made you trust him immediately. He sat down across from Chris and me in a small conference room near Grace's floor and spread several folders across the table. He explained that with 7 victims, extensive video evidence, and Pastor Julius's prior conviction in Ohio, this was one of the strongest cases he'd prosecuted in his 20-year career. The charges would include multiple counts of sexual assault of a minor, production and possession of child pornography, unlawful imprisonment, embezzlement, and violation of sex offender registration requirements. Hull walked us through each charge carefully, explaining what the prosecution needed to prove and what the likely outcomes were. He estimated Pastor Julius was looking at 25 to 40 years in prison, based on the evidence they already had. For the first time since this nightmare started, I felt a small flicker of satisfaction imagining that man locked away forever, where he couldn't hurt anyone else. Hull promised to keep us updated on every development and gave us his direct cell number in case we had questions. He also warned us that Pastor Julius's defense attorney would likely try to paint the girls as willing participants, and we needed to prepare for that kind of victim blaming. Chris asked what would happen if any of the girls refused to testify, and Hull said the video evidence alone was enough to convict, but victim testimony would strengthen the case significantly. Later that morning, Grace met with a therapist named Estelle Benjamin for the first time. I waited outside the small office trying not to listen through the door, but I could hear the low murmur of their voices. After about an hour, Estelle opened the door and invited me inside. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a calm way of speaking that made you feel safe. She explained that Grace was experiencing complex trauma that involved both the sexual abuse itself and the religious manipulation that groomed her into compliance. Grace had to process not just what Pastor Julius did to her body, but how he twisted her faith and spirituality to make her believe the abuse was holy and was chosen by God. Estelle said this kind of religious trauma was particularly damaging because it corrupted something that should have been a source of comfort and meaning. She recommended intensive therapy 3 times a week for at least the first few months, and she mentioned that if Grace's psychiatric symptoms didn't stabilize, we might need to consider a residential treatment program. I looked at Grace sitting there looking so small and broken, and I told Estelle we would do whatever Grace needed. Money didn't matter. Time didn't matter. Grace's healing was the only thing that mattered now. That afternoon, Chris and I met with all the other victims' families in a large group session facilitated by Virginia. We gathered in a community room at the hospital, and I watched other parents file in looking as devastated and shell-shocked as I felt. Virginia had us sit in a circle and invited each family to share their story if they felt comfortable. One by one, parents described how Pastor Julius had targeted their daughters. A mother with red-rimmed eyes explained how he identified her daughter as spiritually gifted during a church retreat. A father with his jaw clenched tight talked about how Pastor Julius isolated his daughter from the family by convincing her that her parents didn't understand her faith journey. Another mother described how Pastor Julius created dependency through intensive mentorship, always being available when her daughter needed someone to talk to, slowly becoming the most important person in her life. As we shared our experiences, a horrifying pattern emerged. Pastor Julius used nearly identical tactics with each girl. He identified them as special and chosen, isolated them from family and friends, created emotional dependency through constant attention and validation, introduced physical touch gradually starting with shoulder squeezes and side hugs, and finally used religious language to normalize the sexual abuse as something holy and ordained by God. One father, a big guy with tattoos covering his arms, asked if we should hire a lawyer to sue the church for letting this happen. Suddenly, everyone was talking at once about accountability and justice beyond just the criminal case. Virginia let the conversation flow for a few minutes, then gave us contact information for an attorney named Bridget White, who specialized in institutional abuse cases. She said Bridget had successfully sued several churches and organizations for failing to protect children from predators. Caroline showed up at the hospital that evening asking to see Grace. I wasn't sure Grace was ready for visitors, but when I asked her, she nodded. Caroline came into the room and immediately burst into tears. She sat on the edge of Grace's bed and apologized over and over for not telling someone sooner about Pastor Julius's behavior. She said she knew something felt wrong about how much time he spent with Grace, about the way he touched her shoulder and looked at her, about the expensive gifts and the special attention. Caroline said she tried to hint to Grace that it seemed weird, but Grace always defended him and said Caroline just didn't understand their spiritual connection. Grace reached out and grabbed Caroline's hand. She told Caroline it wasn't her fault, that she wouldn't have believed Caroline anyway because she was so completely manipulated. Grace said Pastor Julius made her think everyone who questioned him was jealous or spiritually immature. They cried together while I stood by the window trying to give them space. Caroline promised she would testify about everything she witnessed, including the inappropriate comments Pastor Julius made about Grace's body and the way he deliberately isolated Grace from her friends. She said she remembered specific incidents where he told Grace that her old friends were leading her away from God and that only he truly understood her. Watching their friendship survive, this gave me the first real hope I'd felt that Grace could rebuild the relationships she'd damaged during her 6 months of extremism. The next day, Detective Joan Hanks came to brief us on the forensic analysis of the ministry house. She was a tough-looking woman in her 40s who didn't waste time with pleasantries. She spread crime scene photos across the table and walked us through what they'd found. Each girl's room was soundproofed with special insulation in the walls. Each room had multiple cameras, including one hidden in the bathroom ceiling vent disguised as an air freshener. Pastor Julius kept detailed journals in a locked filing cabinet, and the entries were horrifying. He described his spiritual connection with each girl, his plans for deepening their faith journey, and specific details about what he did to them. The journals made it clear that every word and action was calculated and deliberate. Jones said they also found financial records showing he'd been embezzling church funds for 8 months to maintain the ministry house and buy gifts for the girls. He'd taken over $40,000 from various church accounts and covered it up by manipulating the bookkeeping. The fraud charges would add years to his sentence. Joan explained that the level of planning and documentation suggested Pastor Julius was either planning to sell the videos or use them to control the girls long-term if they ever tried to leave or report him. I felt sick listening to her describe the methodical way he'd built his trap. 4 days later, Grace was discharged from the psychiatric unit with diagnoses of acute stress disorder and major depressive episode. The hospital social worker went over her discharge instructions, including medication for anxiety and depression, and scheduled follow-up appointments with Estelle. When they asked where Grace wanted to go, she said she wanted to come home with me instead of going to Chris's place. That felt significant, like maybe she was starting to trust me again. I'd spent the previous 2 days converting my home office into a bedroom for her. I moved out my desk and filing cabinets, brought in a new bed with soft sheets, hung curtains she'd picked out years ago and made it feel like a safe space. I also went through the house and removed everything that might remind her of her extremist phase. I boxed up all the Bible study materials, the prayer journals, the Christian music CDs, the devotional books, and stored them in the garage. When Grace walked into her new room, she looked around and her eyes filled with tears. She thanked me quietly, then went straight to the bed and lay down. She didn't come out for dinner that night or breakfast the next morning. Chris started visiting every day after work. He would sit in the chair next to Grace's bed even when she didn't want to talk, just being present while she stared at the ceiling or slept. He brought her favorite foods from before her conversion, things she used to love but hadn't eaten in months. Thai curry from the place near his apartment, chocolate croissants from the bakery downtown, strawberry smoothies that he made himself. At first, Grace wouldn't touch any of it, but slowly over the course of a week, she started eating small amounts. One evening, I was doing dishes and heard them talking quietly in her room. Grace was asking him about his journey to Christianity, why he chose it, how he knew it was real. Chris admitted he didn't have all the answers, that faith was complicated and personal. Grace asked him how he knew his church was safe, how he could trust religious leaders after what happened. Chris said he didn't know for certain, but he'd learned to look for red flags like leaders who isolated members from family, who claimed special authority over people's personal lives, who discouraged questions or critical thinking. He promised he would be more careful about where he placed his trust, and he said he'd already left New Life Ministry and started attending a different church with better accountability structures. Daniel called that weekend and asked if he could visit Grace. I was surprised when Grace said yes. He drove 3 hours from college and showed up with a huge care package, fuzzy socks with little cats on them. Her favorite candy from when they were kids, those sour gummy worms she used to eat by the bagful. A card that just said, "I love you no matter what," in his messy handwriting. Grace took one look at him standing in her doorway and burst into tears. She apologized over and over for how she treated him, for judging his sexuality, for telling him he was going to hell, for cutting him out of her life completely. Daniel sat on her bed and hugged her while she cried into his shoulder. He told her they were family, and that meant forever, that nothing she said or did during those 6 months could change how much he loved her. He said he knew she wasn't herself, that she was manipulated by someone who twisted her thoughts and beliefs. They spent the afternoon watching old movies on her laptop and eating junk food, and I heard Grace laugh for the first time in what felt like forever. I stood in the hallway watching my children reconnect and felt grateful that something good was emerging from this horror. A week later, all 7 families met with attorney Bridget White to discuss a civil lawsuit against New Life Ministry and the broader church organization. Bridget was a sharp woman in her early 50s who radiated competence and controlled anger. She explained that Pastor Julius's sex offender status was a matter of public record, easily discoverable with a basic background check. The church had a legal obligation to screen anyone working with children, especially in positions of authority and trust. Her investigation had already uncovered that a church board member named Frederica Monk knew about Pastor Julius's history, but argued he deserved a second chance and voted to hire him anyway. The other board members claimed they were never told about his conviction, but Bridget had emails proving that Frederica sent them all detailed information about his past, and they chose to ignore it. The negligence was so extreme and reckless that Bridget believed we could win significant damages to cover therapy costs, medical expenses, and pain and suffering for all 7 girls. She said institutional cases like this usually settled out of court because churches didn't want the publicity, but she was prepared to take it to trial if necessary. She asked each family if they wanted to participate in the lawsuit, and every single one of us said yes. We wanted accountability, we wanted justice, we wanted to make sure this never happened to anyone else. Grace's first session with Estelle happened 3 days after we filed the lawsuit papers. I drove her to the small office downtown and sat in the waiting room flipping through magazines I wasn't reading. The appointment lasted an hour, and when Grace came out, her eyes were red, but her shoulders looked less tight. She didn't say much on the drive home, just stared out the window and picked at her cuticles. I let the silence sit between us because I was learning that sometimes quiet was okay. When we got home, Grace went straight to her room, and I heard her moving around up there for a while before she came back down. She found me in the kitchen making dinner and stood in the doorway for a minute before speaking. She told me Estelle helped her see things differently, that Pastor Julius picked her on purpose during a time when she was looking for something bigger than herself. The extreme religious stuff wasn't really her choice, Grace said. It was the door he used to get close to her and control her. She said she felt angry now instead of ashamed, and Estelle told her the anger was good and healthy, and meant she was starting to heal. I put down the knife I was using to chop vegetables and looked at my daughter. I told her I was angry too, angry at Pastor Julius, and angry at every adult who failed to protect her and the other girls. Grace asked if we could make a list of everything we were mad about, and I thought that was strange, but I said yes. We sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and started writing. Grace wrote down things like being lied to, and having my faith twisted, and losing 6 months with my family. I wrote down churches that don't do background checks, and people who protect predators, and my own rape that I never dealt with. We filled 3 pages, and by the end we were both crying, but it felt different from the hopeless crying from before. This felt like we were doing something, taking action, naming the things that hurt us. Detective Dickerson called 2 days later and asked if Chris and I could come to the station. His voice on the phone sounded heavy and tired. Chris met me there, and we sat in a small conference room with bad fluorescent lighting while Dickerson pulled up files on his laptop. The forensic tech finished going through all the videos, he told us, and the situation was worse than they first thought. Pastor Julius had been running the ministry house for 8 months, not 3 like they originally believed. There were 4 other girls before the current 7, girls who had since turned 18, or moved away, or just disappeared from the church. Dickerson was trying to track them down and contact them, because each one made the case stronger, but also made it clearer how long this had been happening. He showed us a timeline on his computer screen with dates and names, and I felt sick looking at how organized and deliberate it all was. Pastor Julius had a system, a pattern he repeated with each girl. Dickerson said they were reaching out to the earlier victims through social media and old phone numbers, and so far they'd located 2 of them. Both confirmed similar experiences to what Grace and the others described. I asked Dickerson how this went on for 8 months without anyone noticing, and he said that was exactly what the investigation was trying to figure out. Someone at the church had to know something, he said. Too many girls coming and going from that house, too many private meetings, too many red flags that got ignored. Chris sat next to me with his hands clenched into fists on the table, and I could see the muscle in his jaw working. I thought about all those girls and their families, all the parents who trusted a church to keep their kids safe, all the lives that got damaged because adults didn't do their jobs. The rage I felt was different from any anger I'd experienced before. It was cold and focused, and it made me want to tear down every institution that protected predators. Grace came to me a week later while I was folding laundry in the living room. She sat on the couch and twisted her hands together, and I could tell she had something important to say. She told me she'd been talking with Estelle about her options regarding the pregnancy, and she'd made a decision. She wanted to end it. I stopped folding and sat down next to her and told her Chris and I would support whatever choice she made. Grace's eyes filled with tears, and she said carrying the pregnancy would mean 9 months of being reminded every day of what Pastor Julius did to her. 9 months of her body changing because of his crimes. She said Estelle helped her understand this was about her own body and her own future, and she had the right to choose. I hugged her and told her she was brave and strong, and I was proud of her for making a decision that was hers. We called Chris together, and he came over that evening, and the 3 of us sat in the kitchen while Grace explained her choice. Chris cried and told Grace he supported her completely, and he asked what she needed from us. Grace said she just needed us to be there with her when it happened. Virginia connected us with a clinic that worked specifically with assault survivors, and when we called, they were so kind and gentle on the phone that Grace visibly relaxed. We scheduled the intake appointment for the following Monday, and Grace seemed lighter after that, like making the choice gave her back some control over her life. The night before the appointment, Grace came into my room and crawled into bed next to me like she used to when she was little. She asked if I thought she was doing the right thing, and I told her there was no right or wrong, only what felt right for her. She fell asleep there, and I stayed awake watching her breathe, grateful that she trusted me again. The morning of the intake appointment, news broke that Pastor Julius's lawyer was filing motions to suppress the video evidence. Chris called me from work after seeing it online, his voice tight with anger. The lawyer's name was Wagner, and apparently he was known for defending sex offenders with aggressive legal tactics. Wagner claimed the search of Pastor Julius's computer was improper, and the evidence should be thrown out. I felt panic rising in my chest because without those videos, Would there be enough proof? I called Clarence Hull's office, and his assistant said he was already aware and preparing his response. Hull called me back an hour later and told me not to worry. Every motion Wagner filed was getting shut down with detailed legal arguments, and the judge had already ruled the evidence was fine and could be used in court. But then Hull's voice got harder, and he said Wagner was doing something else now. Something worse. He was leaking information to the media, telling reporters that the girls were willing participants in consensual relationships. Suddenly, our private nightmare was playing out on the news. I turned on the TV, and there it was. A segment about the case with Wagner's face on screen talking about how teenage girls sometimes develop crushes on authority figures. I wanted to throw the remote through the screen. Virginia called within minutes and told me she was on her way over. When she arrived, she brought printouts of media coverage and a plan for how we should handle it. She said not to read the comments online, not to engage with reporters, not to respond to anything Wagner said publicly. The victim blaming would be intense, she warned, and we needed to protect Grace and the other girls from as much of it as possible. But even trying not to look, it was impossible to avoid completely. Someone at Chris's work mentioned seeing the story. A neighbor asked me about it at the grocery store. Grace's school counselor called to check in because students were talking about it. The feeling of being exposed and judged was suffocating. The day of Grace's procedure arrived, and both Chris and I took her to the clinic. We got there early in the morning, and there was a single protester outside holding a sign about God's plan. Grace saw the sign and froze on the sidewalk, her face going pale. Chris immediately stepped between Grace and the protester and said something I couldn't quite hear, but his voice was firm and protective. The protester's face changed, and they actually said they were sorry. They didn't know, and they lowered their sign. Chris guided Grace inside with his hand on her back, and I followed, shaking with adrenaline. The clinic staff were wonderful and compassionate. They took Grace back for the procedure, and Chris and I sat together in the recovery room waiting. Neither of us talked much. Chris kept checking his phone, and I kept staring at the wall. After about 2 hours, a nurse brought Grace out in a wheelchair looking groggy and pale but peaceful. She reached for both our hands and squeezed them. On the drive home, Grace was quiet for a while, and then she said she felt like she got part of herself back. She said she knew the procedure didn't erase what happened, but it meant she wasn't carrying Pastor Julius's crime in her body anymore. Then she said something that surprised me. She said she thought she might still believe in God, but she needed to figure out what that meant for herself, separate from everything Pastor Julius taught her. Chris and I exchanged looks in the front seat. I told her that made sense and she had time to figure it out. Grace fell asleep in the back seat, and Chris carried her into the house and up to her room. A few days later, Caroline called and asked if she could organize a small get-together with some of Grace's old friends from before her conversion. She said the girls really wanted to see Grace and support her, but they didn't want to push if Grace wasn't ready. I asked Grace, and she said yes, she wanted to see them. Caroline came over on Saturday afternoon with 3 other girls I recognized from Grace's freshman year. They brought movies and nail polish and bags of candy. I stayed downstairs giving them space, but I could hear them laughing and talking in Grace's room. Normal teenage girl sounds that I hadn't heard in this house for months. At one point, I walked past Grace's door and saw them all sitting on the floor painting each other's nails while a movie played on Grace's laptop. None of them were asking Grace about what happened. They were just being her friends, talking about school and boys and regular things. Grace was smiling and participating, and the difference in her face was striking. She looked more like herself than she had in half a year. Daniel called while the girls were there, and they put him on video chat. He joined the conversation from his dorm room, and all the girls started teasing Grace about her gospel music phase. Grace actually laughed and threw a pillow at the screen. Daniel told her she still owed him an apology for deleting all his Beyoncé songs from the shared family account. The teasing was gentle and affectionate, and Grace took it well, even joining in making fun of herself. When the girls left that evening, Grace came downstairs and hugged me. She said she forgot how good it felt to just be normal with her friends. 2 weeks later, Bridget called and said someone from the church board wanted to apologize to the families. Her name was Frederica Monk, and she was the board member who'd pushed to hire Pastor Julius, despite knowing about his past. Bridget strongly advised against meeting with her, said it could complicate the lawsuit, but she was leaving the decision up to each family. I talked to Chris about it, and we both felt like we wanted to hear what she had to say. 3 other families agreed to meet as well. Bridget arranged for the meeting to happen at her office so there would be a neutral space and legal representation present. Frederica arrived looking 10 years older than her actual age. Her face was drawn and her hands shook when she sat down. She told us she made a terrible mistake advocating for Pastor Julius's hiring. She said she believed in redemption and second chances, that she thought everyone deserved forgiveness and an opportunity to prove they'd changed. She never imagined he would hurt children again, especially not on this scale. She said she'd been praying and going to therapy and trying to understand how she got it so wrong. Her remorse seemed real and deep, but it didn't change anything. I looked at this woman who helped put a predator in charge of children, and I felt nothing but cold anger. When she finished talking, I told her I couldn't forgive her right now. Maybe someday, but not now. Her choice enabled 8 months of abuse. Her belief in redemption over child safety led directly to 7 girls being hurt. She started crying and said she understood. The other parents said similar things. One father told her she should resign from every church position she held. She said she already had. When she left Bridget's office, she looked smaller and broken, but I couldn't feel sorry for her. My sympathy was reserved for the girls whose lives got damaged because adults made bad choices. 6 weeks after Pastor Julius's arrest, the preliminary hearing happened at the county courthouse. All 7 girls had to testify briefly about their experiences, so the judge could determine if there was enough evidence to proceed to trial. Estelle had been working with Grace to prepare her for testifying, teaching her grounding techniques and ways to stay present if she got triggered. Virginia met us at the courthouse and sat with Grace in the witness waiting room. The other families were there too, all of us looking tired and tense. Pastor Julius was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit with his hands cuffed in front of him. Grace's whole body went rigid when she saw him. I put my hand on her back and felt her trembling. The hearing started with the prosecutor Clarence Hull presenting evidence and calling witnesses. The detective testified about finding the girls at the ministry house. The forensic tech testified about the videos on Pastor Julius's computer. Then it was time for the girls to testify. Grace was the 4th one called. Virginia walked her to the witness stand and Grace's hands shook as she was sworn in. Hull asked her basic questions about how she met Pastor Julius, how often they met, what happened during their private sessions. Grace's voice was quiet but clear as she described the grooming process, how he isolated her from her family, how he used religious language to make the abuse seem holy. Then Wagner stood up to cross-examine her. He started asking questions about her willing participation in church activities, trying to suggest she chose to be there. Judge Harry cut him off immediately and warned him about victim intimidation. Wagner backed off, but the damage was done. Grace's face had gone pale and her breathing got shallow. When she was finally allowed to step down, she walked straight to me and Chris. We both put our arms around her and the judge called a recess. In the car afterward, Grace fell apart. She sobbed that having to say those things out loud in front of strangers and Pastor Julius made it all feel real in a horrible new way. I held her in the back seat while Chris drove and told her she was so brave. She did so well. It was over now. A week after the hearing, Chris told me he'd started attending a support group for parents of sexual abuse survivors. He said he found it online and decided to try it because he was struggling with guilt and anger and didn't know how to process it. After his first meeting, he came over to my house looking exhausted but less alone. He said hearing other parents talk about their experiences helped him understand his feelings were normal. The guilt especially. The constant replaying of moments where he thought he should have seen signs or protected his child better. The group facilitator told them that predators are skilled at manipulation, that they're experts at hiding their crimes and parents can't blame themselves for trusting institutions that are supposed to be safe. Chris asked me if I'd thought about getting therapy for myself, and the question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on Grace that I hadn't dealt with my own trauma coming back up. My rape happened 27 years ago, but watching my daughter go through something similar made it feel fresh again. I realized I never properly processed what happened to me, just buried it and avoided churches and tried to forget. Chris said he thought it might help both me and Grace if I worked on my own healing. The next day, I called my insurance company and got a list of therapists who specialized in adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse. I made an appointment for the following week. 3 weeks after the preliminary hearing, Bridget called with news about the civil case. The church organization's insurance company made their first settlement offer, $50,000 per victim to avoid going to trial. Bridget's voice was tight with anger when she told me the number. She said it was insultingly low, barely enough to cover a year of intensive therapy, let alone a lifetime of medical and mental health care these girls would need. She was countering with $500,000 per victim plus full coverage of all therapy and medical expenses for life. She warned that negotiations could take months, and the insurance company would try to drag it out, hoping families would get tired and accept less. All 7 families got on a conference call and agreed unanimously to let Bridget fight for appropriate compensation. We weren't backing down. During that call, one of the other mothers suggested we form a group chat so we could support each other through the legal process. We all exchanged numbers, and by that evening the chat was active with parents checking in on each other, sharing resources, venting frustrations. These people had become strange friends bonded by shared trauma. Our kids all went through the same nightmare, and that created a connection none of us wanted, but all of us needed. I called the school counselor the next morning and explained that Grace needed to come back but would need help. The counselor, Mrs. Stowe, set everything up without making me repeat the details. Grace got a reduced schedule, extra time on assignments, and permission to leave any class if she needed to. Mrs. Stowe talked to all Grace's teachers privately, so they'd know to give her space without asking questions. The first day back, Grace came downstairs dressed for school, but looking like she might throw up. I drove her even though she usually took the bus, and I watched her walk through those front doors with her shoulders hunched like she was bracing for impact. Caroline met her at the entrance and linked arms with her, and that small gesture made my chest hurt in a good way. When I picked Grace up that afternoon, she collapsed into the passenger seat and didn't say a word the whole drive home. She went straight to her room and slept until dinner. The next 4 days went the same way. She'd drag herself to the school, Caroline would stick to her side, and she'd come home completely drained. By Friday, I asked if she wanted to quit, take the rest of the semester off, but she shook her head. She told me Pastor Julius had already stolen 6 months of her life, and she wasn't giving him her education too. That weekend, I made my own phone call to a therapist named Dr. McButler, who specialized in adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse. My insurance covered it, and Dr. McButler had an opening the following Tuesday. I almost canceled 3 times before the appointment, but I forced myself to go. Dr. McButler's office was in a regular building, not connected to any church, which helped. She was maybe 50, with gray hair and calm eyes that didn't show pity when I told her about being raped at 13 by my pastor. We spent that first session just on the basics: what happened, how I'd coped, why I was coming in now. I told her about Grace and Pastor Julius, and how watching my daughter go through this made my own rape feel like it happened yesterday instead of 27 years ago. Dr. McButler asked what I'd done to process my trauma back then, and I admitted I'd done nothing. I'd told my parents, they'd pulled me out of that church, and we'd all agreed to never speak of it again. I'd spent nearly 3 decades avoiding churches, treating all religious people with suspicion and carrying rage I'd never properly dealt with. The anger had just lived inside me, getting bigger and meaner, until I'd exploded at Grace for her conversion. Dr. McButler pointed out that my unhealed trauma affected how I parented Grace, especially my inability to separate her genuine faith exploration from the grooming that was actually happening. I'd been so triggered by her Christianity that I'd missed the real danger signs, and then I'd given her an ultimatum that pushed her straight into Pastor Julius's arms. Dr. McButler was quick to add that I wasn't responsible for his crimes, that predators are skilled at finding and exploiting vulnerable kids, but I could acknowledge that my reaction made Grace more vulnerable. That was hard to hear, but also weirdly helpful, like someone finally named the guilt I'd been drowning in. She gave me homework, writing exercises about my rape, and I left feeling wrung out but slightly less trapped. Daniel called that night to say he was coming home for Thanksgiving, and suddenly it was November. Chris and I coordinated the dinner, deciding to host it at my place since Grace was more comfortable there. Daniel arrived Wednesday night with bags of groceries and a determination to make this feel normal. Thanksgiving morning, the 4 of us worked in my kitchen together. Chris handled the turkey, I made sides, Daniel baked pies, and Grace set the table. It felt stiff at first, like we were all playing roles in a family we used to be. Then Daniel started telling this story about his roommate trying to cook ramen in a coffee maker and somehow setting off the fire alarm at 2 in the morning. Grace actually laughed, a real laugh I hadn't heard in months, and she jumped in with her own story about a chemistry lab where someone mixed the wrong chemicals and created this smell so bad they had to evacuate the whole science wing. Chris and I traded glances across the kitchen, both of us barely breathing, afraid to break whatever spell was making our kids sound like themselves again. We sat down to eat, and Daniel said we should go around the table sharing what we're thankful for, which could have been horrible but somehow wasn't. Daniel said he was thankful for family that sticks together. Grace said she was thankful for Caroline and for second chances. Chris said he was thankful we were all here. I said I was thankful we were healing. We ate turkey and stuffing and pumpkin pie, and slowly the conversation got easier. Grace asked Daniel about his classes. Chris told a funny story about a customer at his work. I shared gossip about my coworkers. We were careful with each other, but not fragile, and by the time we cleared the dishes, I felt something I hadn't felt in over a year. Hope that maybe we could actually rebuild something functional from all this wreckage. The Monday after Thanksgiving, Clarence Hull called to say Pastor Julius's trial date was set for late February, 3 months away. He wanted to meet with all the victims and families to prepare us for what trial would involve. We gathered in a conference room at the courthouse, all 7 families plus Hull and his assistant prosecutor. Hull walked us through the process, explaining that Isaac Wagner would try to paint the girls as willing participants who pursued Pastor Julius, who were seduced by their own spiritual seeking, rather than groomed by a predator. He warned us to expect character attacks, victim blaming, suggestions that the girls lied or exaggerated. Hull said he was confident in his case with all the video evidence and Pastor Julius's prior conviction, but trials were unpredictable, and we needed to prepare emotionally for any outcome. Grace raised her hand like she was in the school and asked what would happen if Pastor Julius was acquitted. Hull's face softened, and he explained that was extremely unlikely given the evidence, but if it happened, we'd still have the civil case, and the sex offender registry violations would put him back in prison anyway. Grace nodded, but I could see her hands shaking in her lap. After the meeting, she asked if she could write a victim impact statement to read at sentencing. I told her we should talk to Estelle about it, and the next therapy session, Estelle helped Grace start drafting it. Over the following weeks, Grace worked on that statement in therapy, writing about how Pastor Julius stole her sense of safety, her faith, her relationship with her family, and her ability to trust her own judgment. She wrote about the pregnancy and abortion, about the shame and confusion, about nightmares that still woke her up at 3 in the morning. She also wrote about her determination to heal and her refusal to let him define her future. When she finally read it to me one evening in December, I cried listening to her strength and courage. I told her I was so proud of the person she was becoming through this impossible situation, and she cried too, and we held each other on the couch until Chris arrived for his evening visit. December was harder than I expected because Christmas was everywhere and Grace couldn't escape it. Christmas music in every store triggered her because of Pastor Julius's twisted use of the Mary narrative. Nativity scenes made her physically sick. Church bells sent her into panic attacks. After finding her crying in the car outside the grocery store because they were playing Silent Night over the speakers, I made a decision. I called Chris and Daniel and said we were skipping Christmas entirely, taking a trip to the beach instead where we could make new memories without religious overtones. Chris found a rental house on the coast, and we drove down 2 days before Christmas. Grace, Daniel, Chris, and I spent 3 days walking on the beach, eating seafood at casual restaurants and playing board games in the rental house. No Christmas music, no nativity imagery, no church services, just family and ocean and space to breathe. Grace seemed lighter there, away from everything familiar and triggering. She told me one night while we walked on the beach that being somewhere new helped her feel less trapped by what happened, like maybe she could build a life beyond the trauma. We came home after Christmas, and in early January, Bridget called with news about the civil case. Her investigation had uncovered something major. The church organization's regional leadership had received 2 complaints about Pastor Julius from parents at his previous church before New Life hired him. The complaints were vague but mentioned inappropriate attention to teenage girls, and leadership had dismissed them as misunderstandings. Bridget found emails proving that regional authorities knew about concerns but hired him anyway. This evidence of institutional knowledge and negligence strengthened our case significantly. Bridget now believed we could win not just compensatory damages, but punitive damages designed to punish the organization's reckless disregard for child safety. The insurance company's settlement offer jumped to $200,000 per victim, but Bridget advised us to reject it and proceed to trial. She thought we could get much more, and more importantly, a trial would expose the institutional failures publicly. All 7 families agreed to push forward. A week later, Grace had a major setback. She was at the grocery store picking up milk when she ran into a woman from New Life, one of Pastor Julius's adult supporters. The woman approached Grace in the frozen food aisle and told her she was praying for Grace to find forgiveness and stop lying about a man of God. Grace had a full panic attack right there, hyperventilating and crying between the frozen pizzas and ice cream. I got a call from the store manager saying my daughter needed help, and I found Grace outside on a bench, Caroline sitting with her trying to calm her down. I helped Grace to the car and sat with her while her breathing slowly returned to normal. Then I marched back into that store and found that woman in the produce section. I told her exactly what I thought of her and her prayers, told her my daughter was raped by her precious man of God, and if she ever approached Grace again, I'd make her regret it. Security asked me to leave, but I didn't care. Nobody got to harass my daughter about her trauma. Grace was shaken for days afterward, barely eating, having nightmares again. Estelle worked with her in therapy to process the reality that some people would always defend predators over victims, that Grace couldn't control other people's ignorance and cruelty, only her own response to it. Chris and I scheduled a session with a family therapist to work on our co-parenting approach. We'd been tag-teaming Grace's care effectively, but we'd never actually discussed our strategy or made sure we were on the same page. The therapist helped us create a shared safety plan for Grace, agree on boundaries and expectations, and develop strategies for supporting her without being overprotective. We talked about communication, about how to handle setbacks, about preparing for the trial. It was the most productive conversation Chris and I had in years, maybe ever. I realized that crisis had forced us to become better partners in parenting than we'd ever been as spouses. We left that session with actual plans and agreements instead of just winging it. In late February, the civil trial against New Life began. Bridget presented devastating evidence of institutional negligence to the jury. She showed emails where Frederica Monk explicitly warned the board about Pastor Julius's sex offender status and was overruled by leadership who wanted to demonstrate Christian mercy. She presented testimony from the previous church's leadership about the complaints they'd sent to regional authorities that were ignored. She brought in expert witnesses on institutional abuse who explained how churches create environments where predators thrive through excessive trust in authority and inadequate oversight. The church's defense attorneys looked increasingly uncomfortable as the evidence mounted. Their argument that the church had acted in good faith crumbled under the weight of emails, testimony, and expert analysis showing deliberate disregard for child safety in favor of religious redemption narratives. Grace took the stand 3 weeks into the civil trial. She wore a simple blue dress and her hair pulled back, and she looked older than 16 somehow. The bailiff swore her in, and she sat down in the witness box with her hands folded in her lap. Bridget stood and asked her to describe how the abuse affected her daily life. Grace's voice stayed steady as she explained the nightmares that woke her up most nights, the panic attacks in crowded spaces, the way she couldn't concentrate in class for months after everything happened. She talked about missing half her freshman year, about losing friends who didn't understand why she changed, about the medication she takes now for anxiety and depression. The jury listened without moving. Grace described how she used to love singing in choir but couldn't anymore, because hymns triggered memories of Pastor Julius's voice during their sessions. She explained how she stopped eating for weeks and lost 20 pounds. She talked about the abortion and how she still dreams about it sometimes, even though she knows it was the right choice. The defense attorney stood for cross-examination and asked Grace about her church attendance before meeting Pastor Julius. Grace answered clearly that she'd been searching for community and meaning. He asked if she'd gone to the ministry house voluntarily. Grace said yes, because she'd been manipulated into believing it was safe. He asked if Pastor Julius ever physically forced her. Grace's jaw tightened and she said he didn't need to use physical force when he had religious authority and psychological control. The attorney tried another angle, asking if Grace had ever told Pastor Julius to stop. Grace looked right at him and said she'd been 15 years old and taught that questioning spiritual authority was questioning God himself. The attorney sat down. Bridget asked one more question about whether Grace felt the church leadership should have protected her. Grace said they had a responsibility to check backgrounds, and they failed, and because of that failure, 7 girls were abused for 8 months. When the judge called a recess, Grace stepped down and walked straight to where Chris and I sat. We both stood and she fell into our arms. I felt her shaking and held her tighter. Virginia came over and told us that was the strongest survivor testimony she'd heard in 20 years of advocacy work. Grace pulled back and wiped her eyes, and I saw something different in her face. She looked exhausted, but she also looked proud of herself, like she'd won something important. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. We waited in a conference room with the other families. Nobody talked much. One mother kept checking her phone. A father paced by the windows. Grace sat between Chris and me with her leg bouncing. When the bailiff came to bring us back to the courtroom, we all filed in and took our seats. The jury foreman stood and read the verdict. They found in favor of all 7 victims on every count. The judge asked about damages and the foreman listed the numbers. Each girl got $750,000 in compensatory damages. Then he said the jury awarded $2 million in punitive damages to be split among all the families. I did the math in my head. Over $19 million total against the church organization. Bridget leaned over and whispered that this would bankrupt the regional organization and force multiple church closures. Some people might feel bad about churches shutting down. I didn't. I felt satisfied knowing there would be real consequences for the institutional failures that let Pastor Julius hurt children for 8 months. The money couldn't undo what happened to Grace or the other girls. But it meant they'd have resources for therapy, for college, for whatever they needed to heal. The judge thanked the jury and dismissed them. We stood and Grace hugged me hard. Chris put his hand on her shoulder. The other families were crying and hugging too. Bridget gathered us all outside the courtroom and explained the church would likely appeal, but she was confident the verdict would hold. She said we should expect the money within 6 months after the appeals process. Grace asked if this meant Pastor Julius's criminal trial would be easier. Bridget said it definitely helped, but the criminal case had different standards. We'd still need to prepare for that fight. 2 weeks later, Clarence Hull called and said Pastor Julius's attorney wanted to discuss a plea deal. I drove to Hull's office and found all 7 families already there. Hull explained that Isaac Wagner had approached him that morning. Wagner admitted the evidence was overwhelming, and Pastor Julius wanted to avoid trial. He offered a guilty plea to all charges in exchange for concurrent sentencing. Pastor Julius would be eligible for parole in 20 years. Hull said he wanted our input before responding. The room erupted. One father shouted that 20 years wasn't enough. A mother said she wanted Pastor Julius to face trial and hear every detail of what he did. Another parent argued that 20 years minimum meant Pastor Julius would be in his 50s before possible release, and trials were unpredictable. Grace sat quietly through all the arguing. Then she raised her hand like she was in class. Hull nodded at her. Grace said she wanted to accept the plea. Everyone turned to look at her. She explained that she didn't want to testify again in more detail about everything that happened. She said 20 years minimum felt like justice, and by the time Pastor Julius got out, he'd be too old to hurt anyone else. She said she wanted this to be over, so she could focus on healing instead of preparing for trial. Caroline's mother agreed with Grace. Then Sarah's father said his daughter felt the same way. One by one, the other families said they'd accept the plea if it meant sparing their daughters another round of testimony. Hull said he'd tell Wagner the deal was acceptable, but only if Pastor Julius allocuted in open court. That meant admitting to all the facts of what he did. No hiding behind legal language. Full admission of guilt in front of everyone. We all agreed to that condition. Hull made the call right there. Wagner accepted. The plea hearing was scheduled for the following week. The courtroom was packed for the plea hearing. All 7 families filled the front rows. Media filled the back. Pastor Julius stood at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs. The judge asked if he understood he was waiving his right to trial. Pastor Julius said yes in that same flat voice I remembered from his office. The judge asked him to allocute. Pastor Julius turned slightly toward the microphone. He admitted to sexually abusing 7 teenage girls over an 8-month period while serving as their pastor and mentor. He admitted to producing child pornography. He admitted to violating his sex offender registration. He admitted to using his position of religious authority to manipulate vulnerable children. His voice never changed tone. He could have been reading a grocery list. I watched his face and realized he wasn't actually sorry. He was just sorry he got caught. The judge asked if he understood the sentencing guidelines. Pastor Julius said yes. The judge accepted the plea and scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later. The bailiff led Pastor Julius away. He didn't look at any of us. Grace let out a long breath beside me. She said she felt relieved it was almost over. I told her the legal process was almost over, but healing would take longer. She nodded and said Estelle had already told her that. Chris drove us home and Grace went straight to her room. I heard her on the phone with Caroline talking about normal teenage things like some movie they wanted to see. The ordinary conversation felt like progress. Grace came to me the next Sunday and said she wanted to attend church with Caroline's family. My stomach dropped. I asked if she was sure. She said she needed to explore what healthy faith looked like separate from her trauma. I was terrified, but I told her I supported whatever she needed. Chris came over that evening and we sat with Grace researching the church Caroline attended. We looked up the leadership structure, the child protection policies, the background check requirements. The church had a female co-pastor and transparent financial reporting. They required 2 adults present for any youth activities. They had mandatory reporting training for all volunteers. Chris called the senior pastor and asked direct questions about their safety protocols. The pastor answered everything without defensiveness. Grace's first service was the following Sunday. I barely slept the night before. Grace came home that afternoon looking thoughtful but calm. She said the sermon was about justice and protecting vulnerable people. She said it felt meaningful, but also strange to be in a church building again. Estelle was helping her process her spiritual journey in therapy. Grace said she was taking it slow, maybe attending once a month to start. I told her I was proud of her for not letting Pastor Julius steal her faith permanently. She hugged me and said she wasn't sure what she believed anymore, but she wanted the freedom to figure it out. Daniel called in early March. He'd finished his degree a semester early and wanted to take a gap year to stay close to home. He'd gotten a job at a nonprofit that provided legal aid to low-income families. He'd also found an apartment 10 minutes away. Grace lit up when I told her. Daniel moved home 2 weeks later and immediately started having weekly dinners with Grace. They'd meet at this Thai place Grace loved and spend hours talking. Grace told me having Daniel around made her feel safer and more connected to who she was before everything happened. I watched them together one evening when Daniel came by to pick her up. He teased her about her terrible taste in music. She threw a pillow at him. He caught it and tossed it back. They laughed like normal siblings who hadn't spent a year estranged. Daniel never treated Grace like she was fragile or broken. He just treated her like his little sister who he happened to love completely. That normalcy was exactly what Grace needed. The sentencing hearing happened on a Thursday in late March. All 7 girls had prepared victim impact statements. The courtroom filled with families, supporters, and media. The judge called the first victim. She walked to the podium and read about how Pastor Julius stole her childhood and her trust in adults. The second girl talked about her eating disorder and self-harm. The third described dropping out of school. Each statement built on the last until the weight of collective trauma felt crushing. Grace went last. She stood at the podium with her statement in shaking hands. Then she looked up and her voice came out clear and strong. She described what Pastor Julius did and how it affected every part of her life. But she also talked about who she was becoming despite him. She said she was learning to trust again, to build healthy relationships, to find meaning in her survival. She said he'd tried to destroy her, but he'd failed because she was stronger than he'd counted on. She said she hoped he spent every day of his 40 years in prison thinking about the 7 lives he'd damaged, and knowing he'd lost everything while they'd gone on to build futures he couldn't touch. The judge listened to every word. Then he announced the sentence. 40 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Lifetime sex offender registration. Lifetime supervision if ever released. The bailiff moved to lead Pastor Julius away. He turned and looked at the 7 girls one last time with that same artificial charm. Grace met his eyes without flinching. He looked away first. Grace walked back to her seat and sat between Chris and me. I took her hand. She wasn't his victim anymore. She was his accuser, and she'd helped put him away. Bridget called the next week with news about the civil judgment. The church organization had filed for bankruptcy to avoid paying. But Bridget had anticipated that and structured the settlement, so the victims were priority creditors. We'd receive most of the money from insurance policies and liquidated church assets. The regional organization was dissolving. Several individual churches were disaffiliating to avoid the scandal. Frederica Monk had resigned from all church leadership and issued a public apology acknowledging her failure of judgment. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But watching the institutional accountability happen felt important, even though it couldn't undo the harm done to 7 girls. Grace finished her sophomore year with decent grades. Her teachers told me they were impressed by her strength and determination. She'd made new friends through Caroline's church community. She'd reconnected with old friends who'd stood by her. Caroline was still her best friend. They were already planning to attend the same college in 2 years. Grace told me one evening that she wanted to study psychology and maybe work with trauma survivors someday. I watched her talk about her future plans and saw her finding meaning and purpose in her survival. She wasn't just getting through each day anymore. She was building toward something. Chris and I kept going to co-parenting therapy. We were building something that looked like friendship. We'd never be romantic again. But we were becoming real partners in supporting our kids. Chris had left his old church and found a healthy community where he was learning what faith looked like without manipulation or abuse of authority. He was also in therapy processing his guilt about not protecting Grace. I watched him become a better father through that painful growth. We had dinner together sometimes, all 4 of us, and it felt almost normal. We'd never be a traditional family again, but we were functional, and that felt like enough. My therapy sessions with Dr. McButler stretched through winter and into spring, each one peeling back another layer of pain I'd buried for almost 3 decades. We talked about the rape itself, about the ways I'd avoided healing by just pushing forward and never looking back. Dr. McButler helped me see how Grace's trauma had ripped open my own wounds, but also how working through this together gave us both real tools instead of just survival tactics. I started understanding that not every religious person was dangerous, that most churches weren't hunting grounds for predators, that faith itself wasn't the weapon even though some people twisted it into one. The work was exhausting, and some days I left her office feeling worse than when I arrived. But slowly I noticed changes. I could drive past churches without my chest tightening. I could hear religious music without immediate rage. I was healing instead of just surviving, and that felt huge after 27 years of running from my own past. The 7 families met at Bridget's office in early summer to discuss what we wanted to do with portions of the settlement money. One mother suggested creating a foundation to help other victims, and suddenly everyone was talking at once with ideas and energy. We spent 3 hours planning, and by the end we'd outlined the Survivors Light Foundation, with a mission to provide free therapy and legal support for clergy sexual abuse victims. Bridget agreed to serve as legal counsel without charging fees. Virginia offered to help develop the support programs using her experience as a victim advocate. We each contributed money from our settlements, and within 2 months we had a functioning nonprofit with a website, referral network, and crisis hotline. Our first year, we helped 23 families navigate the nightmare of reporting abuse, finding lawyers, accessing trauma treatment, and holding institutions accountable. Grace started volunteering with the peer support program, talking to other teenage survivors and sharing her experience. I watched her on the phone one evening, her voice steady and compassionate as she told another girl that healing was possible, that speaking up mattered, that she wasn't alone. Grace was transforming her pain into something that helped others find their voices, and seeing that purpose emerge from such horror moved me beyond words. Grace started her junior year looking different from she had the previous fall. She held her head higher. She smiled more easily. She'd cut her hair short in a style that felt like reclaiming her body as her own, instead of something Pastor Julius had touched. She was only in therapy once a week now, instead of 3 times, and while she still had hard days when triggers hit unexpectedly, she had real coping strategies that worked. She'd made friends at her new church who knew her history and supported her healing. She'd reconnected with her old friend group, who welcomed her back without judgment. One afternoon, she mentioned she was dating someone from youth group, a quiet kid named James who treated her with gentle respect and never pushed her boundaries. I met him when he picked Grace up for a movie, and I watched how he opened the car door for her, how he asked what time I wanted her home, how he looked at her like she was precious. Grace was learning what healthy relationships looked like after Pastor Julius had twisted everything into manipulation and control. She was reclaiming her teenage years piece by piece, building the normal life he'd tried to steal, and watching her laugh with James as they drove away made my chest ache with gratitude that she was finding her way back to herself. Daniel called one Thursday evening asking if he could bring someone home for dinner on Saturday. Grace answered the phone, and I heard her voice get excited as she told him, "Yes, absolutely, bring them." Saturday arrived, and Daniel walked through the door with his partner Alex, and Grace immediately hugged Alex and started asking questions about how they met and what they studied, and did they like Thai food, because that's what we were ordering. The extremist homophobia Pastor Julius had cultivated in her was completely gone, replaced by genuine warmth and acceptance. I watched my daughter welcome her brother's partner into our home with authentic love, and I realized how thoroughly she'd shed the hateful beliefs that Predator had planted. After dinner, Daniel helped me with dishes while Grace and Alex looked at photo albums in the living room. Daniel told me Grace had called him earlier that week to apologize again for how she'd treated him during her conversion, for the judgment and rejection and pain she'd caused. He said he told her they were past it, that what mattered was who she was now instead of who she'd been when someone was manipulating her. Their sibling bond had survived Pastor Julius's attempts to destroy it, and watching them together now showed me they were closer than ever, connected by crisis and genuine reconciliation. Chris texted me about Grace's school concert in early October. I'd forgotten she'd joined choir, but Chris had the date marked on his calendar and suggested we all go together. The four of us sat in the auditorium watching Grace perform, and afterward we went out for ice cream like we used to when the kids were little. We weren't a traditional family anymore, hadn't been for years, but we were functional, and that felt like winning. Grace and Daniel bickered over who got the last spoon of my sundae. Grace teased Daniel about his terrible singing voice and how he'd better never join choir. Chris and I traded stories about the kids' elementary school concerts and actually enjoyed each other's company without tension or resentment. The trauma would always be part of our history, woven into our family story in ways we couldn't erase, but it wasn't defining our present anymore. We were building something new from the pieces, and sitting in that ice cream shop listening to my kids laugh felt like proof that we'd survived and were genuinely okay. The Survivors Light Foundation hosted its first annual fundraiser and awareness event in November, and over 200 people packed the community center, including several of the other victims' families. Grace had agreed to speak briefly about her journey, and I sat in the front row watching my daughter walk to the microphone with her head high. She talked about being groomed and abused, about the long road of healing, about transforming pain into purpose by helping other survivors find their voices. She spoke for maybe 5 minutes, but when she finished, the entire room stood and applauded until Grace's eyes filled with tears. Local news covered the event and interviewed Grace afterward, and she handled their questions with confidence and strength, using her platform to encourage other survivors to come forward and seek help. I watched her speak to the camera about the importance of believing victims and holding institutions accountable, and I realized she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving and making real difference in the world, turning her trauma into advocacy that would help countless others. Grace started working on college applications in December, focusing on schools with strong psychology programs. She wrote her main essay about her experience with Pastor Julius and her commitment to helping other trauma survivors heal from religious abuse. Her school counselor called me one afternoon to say it was one of the most powerful essays she'd read in 20 years of reviewing applications, raw and honest and deeply moving. Acceptance letters started arriving in March, and several colleges offered Grace significant scholarships based on her academic recovery and advocacy work. She got into her top choice with a full ride covering tuition, room, and board. Grace was excited about her future in ways I hadn't thought possible 2 years ago. She told me she wanted to specialize in religious trauma, to help people heal from spiritual abuse the way Estelle had helped her. She had clear goals and genuine passion, and watching her plan for college felt like watching her reclaim the future Pastor Julius had tried to destroy. A letter arrived in April addressed to me with a return address I didn't recognize. I opened it to find pages of neat handwriting from a woman named Catherine, who explained she was one of Pastor Julius's earlier victims from before he came to our community. Detective Dickerson had located her during the investigation and given her our foundation's contact information. Catherine wrote that she'd carried shame and silence about her abuse for 8 years, but seeing Grace and the other girls speak out in court and in media coverage had given her courage to finally address her trauma in therapy. She was doing better now, working through the pain instead of avoiding it, and she wanted us to know that our family's courage to pursue justice had helped more people than we realized. I read the letter twice, then called Grace into the kitchen and read it to her. We both cried, knowing that speaking up had created ripples of healing beyond just our case, that our willingness to face the horror publicly had given other survivors permission to break their silence and seek help. The 2-year anniversary of Pastor Julius's arrest fell on a warm May afternoon. Grace asked if we could visit the beach where we'd spent that first Christmas after everything happened, and I drove us there without hesitation. We walked along the shore with our shoes off, waves washing over our feet, and talked about how far we'd both come. Grace had transformed from traumatized victim to empowered advocate. I'd moved from avoidant survivor to someone actively healing instead of just surviving. Grace told me that what happened to her was horrible, and she wouldn't wish it on anyone, but it had also shown her how strong she was, and what she wanted to do with her life. She said she was grateful for our relationship now, built on honesty and mutual respect instead of the conflict and control that had defined us before. I told her I was proud of the person she was becoming, proud of her strength and compassion and determination to help others. I meant it with my whole heart, and saying those words on that beach felt like closing one chapter and opening another. Grace's graduation arrived in June with perfect weather and a packed stadium. She walked across the stage to receive her diploma with honors, and she was also recognized for her advocacy work with a special award for resilience and community service. Chris, Daniel, and I sat together in the bleachers cheering so loud people turned to look at us, but we didn't care. Afterward, we took what felt like 1,000,000 photos of Grace in her cap and gown, smiling genuinely happy in ways that made my chest tight with emotion. She'd worked incredibly hard to get here, pushing through trauma and depression and anxiety to maintain her grades and graduate on time with her class. This moment represented not just academic achievement, but her complete reclamation of the future Pastor Julius had tried to steal. She was heading to college in 3 months with a full scholarship and clear goals. She was surrounded by people who loved and supported her. She was genuinely okay, and watching her celebrate with her friends, while Chris and Daniel and I stood together, as her family felt like the best possible ending to the worst chapter of our lives. Story continuation. The week before Grace left for college, she asked if we could visit Estelle together for one final therapy session. I drove us to the office on a Tuesday morning, and Grace was quiet the whole way there, picking at her cuticles the way she did when something weighed on her. Estelle welcomed us into her familiar office with the soft gray couch and the plants in the corner, and Grace sat between us looking smaller than usual. She started talking about how scared she was to leave, how the support system here had become her safety net, and then she turned to Estelle with tears already forming. She thanked Estelle for helping her heal, said she couldn't have survived without that support, and her voice cracked on the last word. Estelle leaned forward and told Grace something I'll never forget. She said Grace did all the hard work herself, that therapy just provided tools and space for Grace's own strength to come out. Grace cried harder then, and I reached for her hand while Estelle passed her tissues. Grace admitted she was terrified to leave home and lose access to everything that helped her heal. Estelle reminded her she was taking all her coping skills and growth with her, that healing wasn't tied to this office or this town. I promised Grace I was always just a phone call away, no matter what time or what she needed. Chris and Daniel had joined us for the last 15 minutes, and they both echoed the same thing, that Grace had a whole team behind her even when she was hours away. We threw Grace a going-away party the following Saturday, and our house filled with all her friends, both the ones from before everything happened and the new ones she'd made through her healthy church community. Caroline stood on a chair in the living room and gave a toast that made everyone laugh and cry at the same time. She talked about their friendship surviving everything and lasting forever, about how Grace was the strongest person she knew. The kids spent hours laughing and sharing stories, taking endless selfies with their phones held high, and it was exactly the normal teenage celebration Grace deserved. Daniel showed up with a huge care package he'd put together, and when Grace opened it, she found pepper spray, a list of emergency contacts laminated and hole-punched, and a framed photo of our family from last Christmas. Grace hugged him so hard he made choking noises and pretended to collapse, which made everyone laugh. Chris and I stood together near the kitchen watching our kids surrounded by friends and love, and we shared this look that said everything. We'd all made it through the darkness to this moment of light, and it felt impossible and precious at the same time. I drove Grace to college on a Sunday in late August, my car packed so full I could barely see out the back window. The drive took 3 hours, and we listened to her favorite playlist and talked about everything except the hard stuff. Her dorm was in a building called Harry Hall, and we hauled boxes up 3 flights of stairs because the elevator was broken. Her roommate arrived an hour after us, a girl named Jessica who seemed kind and normal, studying biology and from a town 2 hours west. Grace had already connected with the campus counseling center during orientation and located the nearest therapist who specialized in trauma, and she showed me the appointment card for her first session the following week. She was taking care of herself, building new support systems, and I could see she was ready even though my chest felt tight watching her arrange her desk and hang posters. When it was time for me to leave, I hugged her in the parking lot and didn't want to let go. She whispered thank you for believing me and fighting for me, and I had to swallow hard before I could answer. I told her I would always fight for her, always believe her, always love her exactly as she was, no conditions or limits. I watched her walk back to her dorm in my rearview mirror, and I cried the whole first hour of the drive home. Grace called me after her first week of college, and the change in her voice was immediate. She sounded excited and energized in a way I hadn't heard in years, talking fast about her classes and her new friends. She'd joined the psychology club at their first meeting and already signed up to help with their peer mentoring program. Her roommate was great, her professor seemed interesting, and she loved her abnormal psychology class most of all. She told me about one moment of anxiety when a girl in her dorm mentioned attending a church service, and Grace felt her chest get tight and her hands start shaking. But she used her coping skills, did the breathing exercises Estelle taught her, and the moment passed without becoming a full panic attack. She told me she felt free in a way she hadn't since before Pastor Julius entered her life, and hearing the joy in her voice made every hard moment of the past 2 years worth it. She was building the life she deserved, doing it with strength and courage and hope, and I told her how proud I was before we hung up. Chris and I attended a Survivors Light Foundation board meeting in October, where we reviewed the impact of our first 2 years of operation. The conference room held 12 people, including Bridget and Virginia and several other parents from the original 7 families. The numbers on the presentation screen showed we'd helped 67 families navigate clergy abuse cases, provided over $300,000 in free legal services, and connected hundreds of survivors with therapists who specialized in trauma. Grace had become the Foundation's youth ambassador over the summer, and she was developing a peer support program for teenage survivors that would launch in the spring. The work felt meaningful and important, channeling our family's pain into preventing others from suffering the same way. We were making real changes in how churches screened leaders and how survivors accessed support, and that felt like the best possible outcome from our nightmare. Daniel got engaged to his partner in November, and Grace was thrilled when he asked her to stand in the wedding party. We all celebrated together at Chris's house with champagne and cake, and the joy was simple and genuine. We'd all been through hell together, but we'd come out stronger and more connected than before. The trauma would always be part of our story, but it wasn't the whole story anymore. We were also a story of survival and healing and justice and love that lasted through the worst things. Chris and I watched our kids laughing together, Daniel showing Grace the ring and Grace squealing and hugging him, and we knew we'd done something right raising them to be strong and kind. Grace came home for winter break after her first semester of college, and she was glowing with confidence and purpose. She'd made the dean's list with a 3.9 grade average, found an amazing therapist near campus who she clicked with immediately, and started volunteering at a local crisis center for assault survivors. She told me college was everything she'd hoped for, that she felt like she was finally living the life that was authentically hers, instead of one shaped by trauma or manipulation. We spent the break doing normal family things that felt precious because of how hard we'd fought to get here. We watched holiday movies and baked cookies and had game nights with Daniel and Chris, and the normalcy felt like its own kind of victory. On New Year's Eve, Grace and I stayed up late talking about her goals and dreams for the future, while the TV played in the background. She wanted to get her PhD in psychology, specialize in religious trauma treatment, maybe write a book someday about her experience to help other survivors find their voices. She told me she was genuinely happy now, that the trauma was part of her but didn't define her anymore, and that she was grateful for the strength she'd discovered through surviving. I told her I was in awe of her courage and how far she'd come, that I was excited to watch her build the beautiful life she deserved. As midnight got closer, we poured sparkling cider into wine glasses and stood by the window watching fireworks start in the distance. We toasted to new beginnings and healing and justice and the future we'd fought so hard to reclaim, and I knew with complete certainty that we were going to be okay.